Um, Important text here. Before I get into it, I want to tell you guys a story because I feel safe with you guys. A story about my childhood, a traumatic event. When I was in first grade, my first day of school. Maybe some of you guys remember your first day of first grade. You feel kind of intimidated, right? It's a little scary. You're getting turned loose from your parents, and you should go into this first grade classroom and have the sweet teacher there who welcomes you, and maybe there's some things in there to kind of ease your mind. They can show you maybe there's some cute posters or a nice little reading place, something to make you feel really calm and make you feel like this is a safe place. But when I walked into my first grade room, the thing that jumped out at me was a giant picture of a big ear. That's it. Just an ear. There's no head, nothing else, just an ear. And see, when you see an ear just by itself, it's actually pretty disturbing looking, right? It didn't calm my nerves at all. It was actually very intimidating and very strange. And this ear, it wasn't just a picture of an ear. It was like this sick creature that my teacher invented. The ear had a name. It was Mr. Ear. It was a fitting name. And Mr. Ear was there to hear your tattling. And so this is one of the first things she told us is if you need to tattle, if you want to come tell on somebody, I don't want to hear it. You go to Mr. Ear. And so anytime you ever, if Andrew's hitting you and you go up to the teacher and you're like, hey, Mrs. Massey, Andrew hit you. Are you tattling? Go tell it to Mr. Ear. And so you'd have to walk up and you'd have to go to this big ear on the wall. And in front of the whole class, you'd say, all right, everybody be quiet. Brady has something to tell Mr. Ear. And then and everybody would always whisper because it's super embarrassing, right? And so you start whispering, but you'd have to address him first. You couldn't just say, Andrew hit me. You would have to say, Mr. Ear. And then you'd always try to whisper, Mr. Ear. And then the teacher would say, no, Mr. Ear can't hear very well. You have to speak up. And I just remember, Mr. Ear is an ear. He's got one job. Why can't he hear? And so you'd have to say it real loud in front of everybody, Mr. Ear, Andrew hit me. And it was humiliating. And I remember as a kid thinking, here, I'll get the ear. I know that's disturbing. I'll take that off the screen. I remember as a kid thinking, I'm not safe here. If I have a complaint, if I have an issue, if I'm being hurt, I can't go up and tell my teacher. If I tell my teacher, I'm going to be humiliated. And the whole idea, what I heard as a kid was, if you got a problem, I don't want to hear about it. Something's happened to you, I don't want to hear about it. So I felt not safe. Now, as an adult, I get it. She probably heard a lot of tattling over some silly things. And it was kind of a tool there to make me rethink what I'm going to say, right? Before, is it really worth this? Is this something I can handle myself? And so in some ways I can see how it's a good tool, but I would not recommend using Mr. Ear, teachers. But it made me feel like your complaints are not welcome here. Your problems are not welcome here. I don't want to hear about it. But when I read the Psalms, I hear that we have a God that's not like that. We have a God who is actually welcoming our complaints and actually welcoming our crying out. And I love that Manny mentioned that at a hard point in his life. There is space to cry out to God and say, I am hurting. Or this doesn't feel fair. This doesn't feel right. Now, I'm not saying that God just wants us to complain about every little thing. Maybe it's similar. We need to kind of think through, is this something that I should be crying out to God about or not? But a lot of times, the things that we cry out to God about are things that feel like, this is just outside of my control, God. I don't have the power or the ability to handle this. And so I am suffering and I am crying out to you. And so the Psalms of Lament show us there is space for this kind of prayer, of being honest with God about what we're really dealing with and struggling with, honest about how we feel and that we're in pain. And for some people, as we talk about rekindling faith, this has rekindled the faith of some people, realizing that, hey, there is space in here for being very real with God. I don't always just have to tell God what I think he wants to hear. I can go back to the Psalms and see there are Psalms of lament. There are people crying out and hurt. And when I do that, and when I have this kind of honesty with God about my doubts and about my struggles, it actually makes the relationship more intimate. The more real I am with God in my prayer, the more intimate it becomes. And we believe some of the Psalms were written by David. And maybe he was a man after God's own heart because of his honesty, because he was willing to share all of himself with God, the joys and the struggles. But here the psalmist is crying out about some very real issues. You know, it could be in reference to the exile. It sounds like maybe it's someone living in exile, but we don't really know. And I like that it's kind of vague, because that way when we read it, it's not like, oh, this is just someone in an exile. It doesn't apply to me. It's just vague enough where we can all read it, and maybe at some point in our life, we've identified with some of the feelings that the psalmist is going through in this psalm. But he says some really hard-hitting things. I mean, he's basically saying, God, have you quit caring about us? Have I done something wrong? Have I done something wrong to deserve this? What is going on? Have you totally abandoned us? I've heard you are slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, but it doesn't feel like that right now. Have you given up on your covenant? Are you really who I've been told you are? Are you really who I think you are? And these are tough questions. They seem almost rebellious, but maybe you've all felt these at some point. Maybe you've asked these things at some point. It's being very real with God, and I think there's definitely space for that. It's an example of confessing one's doubts to God. I know sometimes we're told, like, if you doubt, you're a brat. And like, okay, maybe sometimes that's the case. But not always. Sometimes there's space for that and wrestling with that with God. We shouldn't just live in the doubt. We shouldn't just live in the complaining, though. And that's not what's happening in the Psalm of Lament either. There's some crying out, there's some struggle, there's some questioning, saying, why is this happening? But then the psalmist moves to something else. He does something really interesting. Basically, he zooms out. He looks at the past and he thinks about what God has done. He remembers all his works, all he's done, not just what's going on in the present moment. He thinks about all of who God is. And as he speaks and as he goes on, it sounds like he mentions Moses, he mentions Joshua and Jacob, and he's reminded that God is in control. And it doesn't actually answer all of our questions. It doesn't actually say, well, here's why this is happening. But he can zoom out and say, okay, this gives me some perspective. I know that God is the author of so many good things, and he is just too powerful, and he is just too good, so that whatever I'm going through right now in this present moment, I may never understand why. I may never be able to make sense out of it, but I believe that God is good, and so in the grand perspective of things, I can live with this. Maybe there's not an exact answer. So it's kind of like saying, I don't like it. I don't like what I'm experiencing, but I still believe God is good, and I can even trust him in this moment. And I know in one way, form, or fashion, this good God will one day make all things right. He was good in the past, he's good in the present, and he will be good in the future. If he can do what he did in the past, he can help now. And so reminiscing, looking to the past, gives hope for the present. Remembering the past and the good things God has done it's actually an act of worship. It's acknowledging God's goodness. And in a sense, remembering the past, it brings the past to the present. And so I mentioned Taylor Swift. Look, I'm not like this big T-Swizzle fan, okay? I tolerate Taylor Swift. But there was a song a long time ago, and it's a song that's actually pretty meaningful to my wife and I. It's called Mine. It was back when she pretended to still be country. Y'all remember that? It was about 13 years ago. It was about 2010. It's a really sweet song. And it's kind of going through this relationship. But in a lot of ways, me and my wife see ourselves in some of the stuff in this song. And, she kind of talks about meeting this college sweetheart, and everything's sweet and everything's good. And, they got the butterflies. But then they get married. Oh, and they start living together, and they have to pay bills. They're trying to figure out this adult life stuff, and it's just not going well. It's not what they thought. And in the chorus, she says, whenever things got hard, I would remember what it was like when we first met. I remember us sitting by the water, and you put your arm around me for the first time, and we just fell in love, and you're the best thing. You're the best thing that's ever been mine. And so she's saying, in the hard parts, I kind of zoom out, and I remember how it was. And then at the end of the song, kind of talks about fighting and it getting really bad. And then at the end of the song, it's told from the boyfriend or the husband's perspective, saying, oh no, I remember. It's the same thing. I'm not going to leave you because I remember how we felt. I remember how I felt about you. And I know deep down those feelings are still there. It hasn't changed. Yeah, I've seen a different side of you. Yeah, I've said hurtful things. We've said hurtful things. We've been in this bad part in our relationship. But all the way I felt about you, it's all still there. And I'm not going to give up on us. So it's actually a really sweet song. And so as far as relationships go, you can zoom out. Remember the good times. It's actually a really good thing to do in your relationships, marriage or otherwise, is to reminisce. Look at old pictures. Go do the things that you used to do together. It can draw you together as a couple again. It brings the past to the present. It's celebrating what was. But it's also saying, really our text in this Taylor Swift song, is saying, when you look at the past, you're focusing on the good things. Focus on the good moments and the good memories of the relationship. Sometimes in relationships, especially when we've been in them for a long time, with God or with a significant other, we get hung up on the negative things rather than the tons of great things. We miss all the encouragements and compliments and the ways that we might be getting built up, and we focus on the one criticism. So we really need to make a practice of noting, naming, and relishing the good things that our significant other does, but also that God does. So that's what the great relationship expert Taylor Swift tells us. But it really is similar to what the psalmist is saying. It hurts right now, but remember what God has done. Zoom out. Don't focus just on the pain of the moment. Where has he been working? Where has he been helping you? Where in your life can you give praise to God that builds hope? Maybe there's a time he revealed himself to you in some powerful way. Maybe a friend spoke to you the right words at just the right time and you knew that was from God. Maybe he protected you or healed you in a way that only God could, in a way that was totally out of your power. Maybe he guided your decisions in a powerful and life-changing way. We need to remember and celebrate these things and live in these things, especially when life is getting hard, especially when we're kind of wondering, where's God at right now? We need to celebrate where he was, knowing he will be present again. And look, it doesn't solve all of our problems. It doesn't totally prove God, but it gives you something to hold on to through the rough seasons of life. And it gives you some perspective. It helps you to not take the good things God has done for granted. And it reminds you God is good. God will come through. So this morning, I pray that you can take a moment to look back and celebrate the good things that God has done, the good things God has put in your life, the people, the experiences, the joys, the comforts that God has given you. And that we can have this wider panoramic perspective that gives us a faith that is not conditional to the moment. We want a faith that is not conditional just to the moment we are in, but a mature faith that withstands our whims and our little bits of anger towards God or others. A faith that has a longevity and perspective to know there are ups and downs, and God is present in both. There are ups and downs in our lives. There are ups and downs in our spirituality, but God is still there whether it feels like he's not, or whether it feels like he is or not. We have a God who wants to grow you. We have a God who wants to stretch you, wants to use you, and wants to be with you. And it is my prayer that we rekindle our relationship with him, that we do some things in our own life differently, and that we become more open to his transformation. So as we wait, whatever state we're in our spirituality right now, whatever state we're in with our relationship with God right now, may we know and believe God is good and wait on him and hope. If you have any need at all, if you want to give your life to Christ, we invite you to come now as together we stand and sing.